Let's invite him in.
Morning, everyone. Welcome to our final lecture of the Crawford Logan Center for Addiction Research and Treatment Seminar Series. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, the Crawford Logan Center serves as a hub for research and community engagement and treatment of addictions here at the University of Kansas. And one of our flagship events is to sponsor the seminar series where we bring in leading experts from around the country to come and share their work with us. Today, we're very fortunate to have a colleague from the University of California, San Francisco. And one of my fellow faculty is going to do the introduction for our speaker in just a moment. If you are wanting to know more about the speaker series and what's coming up in the spring, you can go to addiction.ku.edu, or you can follow us on Twitter @AddictionKU. We bring all of the talks and all of the events there. Something we're working on for the spring, which we're very excited about, is possibly partnering either with the Lawrence Library or with Free State to do a Science on Tap focused on vaping in youth and teens. And so that will be coming hopefully in the month of February. So keep an eye on our spaces for developments with that. So introduce Dr. Brianna McGue, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, Michael. Okay. So when I was a PhD student in California, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I had an interest of substance use, LGBTQ health disparities, and clinical interventions. 3 different people were like, you gotta find Anissa. And all 3 of them said almost exactly the same thing. Anissa is so smart, so successful, and so kind and supportive. And I think that has just really been my experience with Anissa. So in terms of more formal credentials, she's a clinical psychiatrist or clinical psychologist at UCSF, in the community health systems and school of nursing, as well as working for Alliance Health Project within the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, School of Medicine. So Dr. Fuente's research has targeted multiple ways to reduce health disparities among sexual and gender minority people, including prevention, increasing visibility in research, understanding the biological mechanisms of minority stress and substance use, and developing interventions to reduce minority. And Dr. Fuente was also the inaugural recipient of the 2018 National Institutes of Sexual and Gender Minority Investigator Award, recognition contribution to sexual and gender minority research. And also the associate director of the UCSF site for the PRIDE study, large national longitudinal data set focused on the health of LGBTQ folks. Just enrolled 23,000 sexual and gender minority people today. In addition to her impressive scholarly accolades, she recently won an outstanding mentorship award for her work with new faculty members as well as graduate students. And I certainly have been really grateful for Anissa's mentorship along the way. And I'm so glad you're here. So let's welcome Dr. Fuente.
Oh, what a lovely, warm introduction. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me here today at the University of Kansas, which is actually my home state of Kansas, where I grew up, but have not lived for many decades. So it's lovely to be back, though. So today I'm going to talk with you about understanding and reducing substance use and other health disparities among sexual and gender minority individuals. So I'm going to give kind of an introduction to a few things, some key terms and background, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I'll talk a little bit about how we understand health disparities among sexual and gender minority people. We'll talk about minority stress and how we think about kind of minority stress and some of the biological mechanisms. And then how do we think about doing something about this and eliminating some disparities. So for background, some of the kind of key terms that I will be using is this term sexual minority. And this is based on sexual orientation and can include lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and any other non-heterosexual people. Whereas gender minority is really based on gender identity. This can include people who are transgender or have non-binary or other gender expansive identities. Super quick introduction to sexual orientation, which we could spend, literally years talking about, but Sexual orientation is a multidimensional construct, and at minimum, we think about it having like 3 dimensions, one of which is identification, which you're probably all familiar with. This is the idea of like, how do you think of your own sexual orientation? It also includes behavior, like who people are sexually active with. And finally, attraction, who are people attracted to? And these different components of sexual orientation do not need to align for people, and frequently they don't. Thing that we know, and actually I put PMIDs, if you want to look up any of these articles, these are all our articles, they're in the corner if you want to find the studies. But sexual orientation can be fluid over time. So this was a study of 300 women who were followed over 7 time points. They were unstably housed. And we see that among 300, we had 49 participants who reported changing sexual orientation over all the study visits. So, when you're thinking about measuring something like sexual orientation or gender, it actually can be quite fluid and changing longitudinally. Another thing is that terminology can change over time. So here you can see, this is like what was recommended in 2008. People usually don't like this question anymore. So moving forward, this is what we asked in the PRIDE study. And actually, this is what we asked in 2019. It's expanded more since then. You can see that we have multiple options for sexual orientation. And that's because community members have really changed the way that they use language to identify themselves, really to get more specific. Now, gender is also a multidimensional construct, which at minimum includes kind of an internal understanding of your own gender. Also gender expression, like how, mannerisms, dress, also gender identification. So again, that kind of like term that you might use. There are some gender minority subgroups that are important to think about. Some folks are on a gender binary, which means they identify mostly along a masculine spectrum or in a feminine spectrum. And then there is, even a really largely growing cohort, I would say, of people who we would call gender expansive. This can include people who are identify as non-binary, but also people who have other genders that don't fit on this like masculine or feminine spectrum. So those are kind of like subgroups among this group. Then we have researchers here today. So one thing I will like throw out methodologically wise is when gender minority people, many gender minority people will only identify their gender as man or woman. So frequently researchers will say, I don't see transgender people in my sample. And it's like, well, how did you assess gender? Because a lot of people will just say, yeah, I'm a man, right? And without careful assessment of gender and sex that was assigned to somebody at birth, you may have trans people in your sample and just not know. Or if you don't offer kind of expanded options, you also wouldn't know. There have been a lot of barriers to sexual and gender minority health knowledge over the years. These are a couple of papers we did. One where we looked at the substance use literature and looked at how many people were reporting sexual orientation and gender identity. Really, the answer is very few, like almost none. And then in this study here, we actually looked specifically at randomized controlled trials, anxiety and depression, to find out like how many sexual and gender minority people were in these samples. And the answer was, well, nobody tells us, And so what does that mean? It really questions what we know about mental health, substance use interventions, and how those results can be applied to sexual and gender minority people. Because we haven't tested it. We don't know if people were in those samples. We don't know if there were, different treatment effects. So what we do know, though, is that there have been a lot of documented health disparities. So we see that sexual and gender minority individuals have higher rates of mental health and substance use problems, and also higher rates of physical health problems. So things like poor general health status, and also higher rates of specific diagnoses, asthma, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, disability even. The really important question then is not just, okay, that's what's happening, but what is accounting for those differences? And for that, what I've looked to in my work is the minority stress model. It was put forth by Alon Meyer, who's now at UCLA, the Williams Institute. So the minority stress model says that there's an extra stress burden put upon sexual and gender minority people above all of the stressors that we all experience, things like, do we have enough money? How's our health? But there's an additional stress burden really put together by 4 components. The first of which is regular experiences of prejudice or discrimination. This can be outright victimization or violence. It could be discrimination, or it can even be microaggressions. So things like not seeing yourself on the research form you're filling out, for example. The second component of Myers minority stress model, we're putting forth this idea that people expect prejudice or discrimination, not necessarily even because they've experienced it, but because we can learn by watching, we are going to likely experience that. That can also be related to this kind of question, like, so here you have a couple of guys walking down the street, holding hands, and they're asking themselves, is this safe? Concealment of minority identity, let's our hands in our pockets, is an additional a component of the minority stress model. And the last kind of component of the minority stress model is the internalization of societal stigma. And I'll say that this whole model was put forth for sexual minority people. It actually has been generalized to gender minority people with a few nuances. So we can think about this as a model that we can hold in relation to both populations. This is actually the Westboro Baptist Church. I know we're not far from their home. I always think about them because when I was growing up and was a teenager, these folks were downtown protesting regularly, our restaurants who were hiring gay people, and it was like just constant. So this is an extreme example, but that internalization of societal stigma can be a lot more subtle, and subtle stuff can have a lot of impact. So I've explained this whole minority stress model, but what do we know about how minority stress is related to substance use and other mental health outcomes? This is a fantastic piece of work done by my colleague, Nick Livingston, who's at the Boston VA now. Actually, 2 papers here. What we did in this study was we used ecological momentary assessments. So that's like a frequent assessment throughout the day of someone's daily experiences. And we followed sexual and gender minority people over a period of 2 weeks. We measured nicotine, alcohol, drug use. We also measured mood, anxiety. And we measured whether or not they'd experienced mistreatment in general, and if they'd experienced mistreatment related to their sexual and gender minority status. And what we found is that there were greater odds of subsequent nicotine and substance use when someone experienced mistreatment, and that the strongest effects were present when they'd experienced mistreatment related to their sexual and gender minority status. And these effects increased in magnitude throughout the day. So the health is an elegant study, which really got us this temporal relationship that even within day, if somebody's having one of these events, it's increasing their likelihood to smoke tobacco, to use drugs and alcohol. We also had a follow-up study that looked at mood and anxiety, and we see those same peaks, right? Which are related, right? You have if your mood's impacted, then of course substance use may also be a way to cope. So here we have this like minority stress model, all the different components we talked about, with the idea that it's impacting and leading to substance use. I also alluded to this other concept, this idea that we also know that sexual and gender minority people have higher rates of physical health problems, right? So not just mental health and substance use and behaviors, also physical health problems. So the question is, what accounts for this difference? And this is the question that I sought to unpack as I was kind of starting out my career. One of the first things that we did was to do a systematic review. So, we looked in all the databases, searching for articles that looked at any biological outcome and any minority stressor and tested that relationship. And so what we retrieved were 26 articles that tested this relationship in some way. And what we found is that a little over 40% of those articles detected a relationship between minority stress and a biological outcome. Now, relationships were detected between minority stress and physical health, incidence of respiratory infection, immune response, HIV-related laboratory outcomes, HIV-related symptoms, treatment side effects, AIDS mortality, changes in cardiovascular function, BMI, actually, cortisol, and also cancer incidence and side effects. A lot of stuff, right, where we're seeing these relationships between minority stress and what we would consider kind of physical health outcomes or biological outcomes, which led us here to develop this more expanded conceptual model. So here, we again have minority stress over on the left side here. We have these potential clinical outcomes that are important to improving health over here on the right. What we put together here was this model to try to think about what might be happening among sexual and gender minority people. And again, this literature was based on sexual minority people because it just isn't out there among gender minority people yet. What might be happening along this path? And so we kind of isolated these biological functions that might be occurring kind of at a global level, things like inflammation, immune function, cardiovascular function, metabolic function, and also endocrine and hormonal function. This idea that perhaps there were epigenetic changes that were happening and changing gene expression or transcriptional regulation, and certainly that there was kind of a dysregulation of the HPA axis occurring as well. So, what does that mean? Well, it gave us a testable model to start to pick apart what might be happening in terms of the relationship between minority stress and health among sexual and gender minority people. And the first place we decided to look was right here, actually, looking at this mechanism that relates to these biological functions. So this study here is where we kind of investigate how does minority stress get under the skin? And we did it by looking at leukocyte gene expression in sexual minority men living with treated HIV infection. The goal again of this study was to understand the relationship between minority stress and physical health among specifically sexual minority men who had fairly recently used stimulants. And specifically to examine the relationship between minority stress and gene expression, focusing on genes that we saw in this kind of causal pathway: inflammation, immune function, cancer, and cardiovascular function. So people might wonder, why gene expression? Why look at this as a potential outcome? One of the things that's been quite well documented is that gene expression changes in response to stress. Things like chronic interpersonal stress, social isolation, also acute stressors, like you're about to take a test, gene expression is changing. And those are all components of this minority stress kind of experience, right? These different chronic and acute stressors. Importantly to me, as a clinical psychologist, we see gene expression changes in response to psychological interventions. So, we're always measuring self-report outcomes or clinician-assessed outcomes. You can actually track biological changes as a result of psychological interventions in something like gene expression. So that was one reason why I wanted to start looking here. Quick lesson on gene expression methods. When it comes to gene expression, you've got a lot of genes, and you can look at single gene expression. So this study is not ours, but this was an elegant study. And what you can see up here is that this black bar, these are participants. Each column here is a different participant who had a trauma, okay? And the blue bar are people who did not have a trauma, they're the control condition. And each row here is a different gene. And what you see is if it's red, then you're seeing higher levels of expression. If it's blue, you're seeing lower levels of expression. And so you see this kind of like nice checkerboard pattern emerge, which means that there's differentiation between these groups in terms of what's happening physically related to this phenotype or variable. Single gene expression is neat. It's like turn it on, turn it off, like single gene. What's maybe more relevant are networks of genes that work together, right? Because this is where you think about something giving rise to like a biological process. When networks work together, that's where you might see like an uptick in inflammation. So we also look at biological pathways when we look at gene expression. So in this first study, we had 38 sexual minority cisgender men, all of whom were living with HIV. They all had been using methamphetamine, and they were all on antiretroviral therapy with really well-controlled HIV. So we controlled for that. And we did leukocyte RNA sequencing, so that's from blood, and we measured minority stress through a measure called the CARS. Looked at, as I said, a little over 19,000 single genes. You do use a procedure to adjust for multiple comparisons when you do this work. So wasn't that many analyses without an adjustment. And we were really testing low versus clinically elevated minority stress. So two different groups put against each other. So we did this biological pathway analysis looking at sets of genes together. For our demographics, we didn't see a lot of differences between our two groups, and we had a fairly diverse sample of participants. And here's our results. So when we looked at the high versus low minority stress groups, we saw a difference in 90 genes. And then what we did was we looked at those genes and we looked at whether or not they were relevant to any of these processes that we were hypothesizing. And we found that there were genes relevant to inflammation, immune function, cancer, and cardiovascular function. Cancer is probably inflated because there's a lot of research on gene expression in cancer, so there's just a lot more genes that are tagged that way. And then you can see results. This kind of pink color here, these are people in the high minority stress condition. And the more purple color here, they're in the low minority stress condition. You don't see that perfect checkerboard we saw with the trauma study. You do see some differentiation, right? Where you can see, what we would think of as something that's contributing to the variability in gene expression. Also did that biological pathway analysis. And again, we found 138 gene sets that were really evidencing two-directional perturbation. And the pathways, we looked at them, and again, they weren't relevant to our hypothesized kind of mechanisms. So the implications, we thought that the pathways that we were thinking about, inflammation, immune function, cancer, cardiovascular function, are worth pursuing, right? We get a signal here that minority stress really may be an additional predictor of the biological cascade that could impact the health of, in this case, particularly sexual minority men living with HIV who use stimulants. But of course, replication is warranted. Limitations, cross-sectional study. Participants had recently used methamphetamine, which we did covary for, and we put out another paper that showed that gene expression was actually different depending on whether or not people were had positive urine toxicology for stimulants. And of course, all of these men were living with HIV, which probably creates a whole different host of responses to stress when we look at something like gene expression. We need to replicate this work in sexual minority women and also gender minority people, and also just to replicate the findings given the small sample. This is certainly my area of research, but I'm a pretty skeptical scientist. So I was surprised when we get the result that we thought we would get. And I just wanted to point out that this was not a standalone result. So this was a study that kicked off a lot of other studies, and I'll just highlight a few of the other studies. This one project was led by my colleague, Will Vincent, who's at Temple. And this was looking at KT ratio, or kynurenine tryptophan ratio. And that KT ratio is associated with faster HIV progression. Right? And so here we were looking at openness or outness about one's sexual orientation, which would be presumed to be kind of protective, if you can be open about your sexual orientation in relation to KT ratio. What we found was pretty interesting. So we were looking at KT ratio over time. And if you look at this red line here, you can see that if you're open about your sexual orientation, your KT ratio is going down. That would be good for your health, right? Related to less HIV progression. This red line is only white men, white sexual minority men. And if you look at the blue line here, more sexual minority men of color, for whom you do not see any benefit to openness about one's sexual orientation. So again, we're detecting the effect. We're also seeing that for some subgroups that effect is different and that intersectionality is really important. So another interesting kind of result. And that paper was also not a standalone result. So in this study, we looked at epigenetic aging. So you can look at DNA methylation as a marker of what's happening epigenetically. And we have these kind of clocks, epigenetic clocks that we can look at that should pretty well predict your age. So if you're 39, your epigenetic clock ideally says that you're 39 years old. What we found is that the higher people's sexual minority stress was, the more you saw accelerated epigenetic aging, which means that people's DNA is basically showing them at an older age than they should be. So higher sexual minority stress, you see an accelerated epigenetic clock. We also had a marker of telomere length estimated through the DNA methylation, and we see a similar result. Shorter telomeres, it's kind of accelerated aging, and here we see higher minority stress, shorter telomeres. That paper also just came out. So hopefully I'm gonna use some evidence to think this model is worth at least thinking about a little bit. Back to our big model here. We've got all these kind of mechanistic things to think about, but again, I'm a psychologist, so what do we do about all this? Right? So we have this whole model, and if we want to simplify it again, we're thinking that our minority stress model is related to both physical and mental health. Well, what can we possibly do about that? This is the same kind of model, just a simplified, clinically actionable version. One thing we could do is kind of think about reducing minority stress to get in front of it, to prevent problems, totally worthwhile. We can also think about providing treatment. So, okay, you've already got physical and mental health problems. Like, how do we provide good treatment for LGBTQ plus people? That's also really important, but a little more defeatist, right? It's already done. We can also think about how we change this path. Like, okay, so this is going to happen. Minority stress is out there. How do we change the path and sort of intervene to make sure it's not impacting the health of sexual and gender minority people? We've done work on all of these kind of angles. So these were reducing minority stress. We did some studies looking at gay-straight alliances in high schools, and we found that they were related to lower substance use, both for high school students and also for college students. So, this is worth pursuing, these interventions to kind of make the environment better. But right now, it's rocky out there. Better than what you've got to be straight alliance. We've also done plenty of studies looking at treatment. Today, I'm going to talk with you about this kind of intervening path, changing how we cope with minority stress, not just as a way to make things better, but also to think about what we can learn about how oppression in general may be impacting health and how we can interrupt that. So for this study, we developed a cognitive behavioral intervention titled Awareness for Sexual and Gender Minorities. And this is really, it's got this great little acronym. Gotta have a good acronym in your studies. But this is really an intersectional minority stress intervention designed to change that pathway and change how people cope with minority stress. This is kind of a diagram of the awareness intervention. This is the one I'm going to talk about today. We actually have 10 sessions now because we have a first session for intersectionality, which is based on feedback that we got. But we tested out this 9-session version where you see kind of 2 sessions for each of these components of minority stress that we've talked about. And in the first session of each of these components, there's typically a psychoeducation. So some education about how this element of minority stress will affect health. And also how we kind of pay attention to and notice and name it. Always, in most cognitive behavioral interventions, outside of a session assignments, some things like tracking forms so that people can notice the new concept that they've learned in their daily lives. And then in the follow-up session, so 2, 4, 6, and 8, we teach different coping strategies for coping with each element of minority stress. So we go through all of these sessions and have a final kind of consolidation, making meaning session to help people remember and execute the cognitive behavioral principles in their lives. Now, at its core, this intervention is actually about making intentional, values consistent decisions when encountering minority stress. So this is not a come out to the world right now intervention. That's not what the goal is. The goal is to be thoughtful about kind of how you move through the world, how your decisions there are impacting you, and being able to alter those decisions to be values consistent. Skills, of course, to cope with all that minority stress. So here's an example of an activity. This is a psychoeducation activity. It was in like a trifold kind of brochure. So the year is 2001, and these individuals are minding their own business. We have same-sex couples and couples, heterosexual couples. Some scientists came along and asked people questions about their mental health. And then 3 years later, the scientists came back and again asked them questions about their mental health. So this was between 2001 and 2004. It's a real research study. So over 3 years, the gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals living in the blue states saw large increases in depression, anxiety, and alcohol use disorders, in a 248% increase in anxiety. That's very large, right? For the same 3 years, heterosexual individuals in the blue states saw no changes in mental health. When you go to the red states, and you look, you see over the same 3 years, gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals living in red states saw very little change in their mental health, nor did heterosexual people. And so this is when we ask people in the intervention, so this is a handout in the intervention, what do you think is happening here? You know, and they get to think, I don't know. We've got all kinds of answers. Is there a hurricane? So, you know, the heterosexual individuals weren't impacted by the hurricane. This is the kind of conclusion. People in the blue states lived in states that passed bans on gay marriage, right? So there was outward legislation happening. This is so relevant to what's happening right now. People in the red states, however, lived in states that did not pass bans on gay marriage. The information, the psychoeducation here, that discrimination can actually put you at risk for mental health problems. You're not imagining it. You're imagining feeling anxious. Like, this is actually a risk. It's a thing that we, the scientists, have observed. So part of the idea here was to empower people. I don't need to sit here with all the knowledge about discrimination. Guess what? You can know you're not imagining that you're feeling terrible after this experience. We know that this exists. So what do we do about it? Here's another kind of psychoeducation handout focused on hypervigilance or anticipating discrimination. It talks about how, you know, anticipating discrimination in the right circumstances is really good, or anticipating danger. You know, it helps us get ready to escape and can really be protective. If we're chronically anticipating discrimination, it's actually bad for our health. It can change chemicals, cause collection of fat around the waist, also lead to cigarettes, alcohol, drug use, right? So again, trying to help people understand that these connections are there, that we know that they exist. An example of one of our tracking forms that we use. So you can see this is actually like session 4. We have intentional attention. So this is like mindfulness, if you're familiar with mindfulness, paying attention to your surroundings, what you notice, finding out your settings, and then tracking your thoughts that discrimination might occur. So making it more explicit. And we do this because, you know, what we found even in our pilot work with this intervention is that people were modifying their behavior based on events that happened 20 some years ago. Right? So they just didn't even have the thought that discrimination would occur. They just modified their behavior. So here we're trying to make this conscious, bring it to the top. It's your body sensations, any actual discrimination or safety encounters, choice on how to cope, because we've given coping skills by this point. And then also tracking affirming events, mood, substance use over the sessions. So we piloted this first with sexual minority men living with HIV who used substances. We excluded people with severe substance use disorder because they would be better treated by an intervention targeting substance use specifically, and also current bipolar or psychotic disorder. We did this pilot with 10 men, really to look at acceptability and to inform a revision of the manual. And then we did a pilot randomized controlled trial with 42 men to really test and garner kind of a feasibility study. In our open phase pilot, we had 10 participants, 8 of them completed. Everybody said that they learned new skills. They all said that they would recommend the intervention. They said that they got something of lasting importance. We demonstrated acceptability, and we also conducted interviews. We did thematic analysis. You can check out the paper if you want to know all the themes. But I did want to highlight kind of people said that they gained skills in our thematic analysis. So here is an example. Participant said, it's lowered my stress level a lot and how I handle situations in regards to like, instead of personalize them or go, oh my God, instead stepping back, take a minute to breathe, think your thought process, separate your thoughts from your emotions and go from there and respond. So seeing evidence of what we would have really hoped for in a cognitive behavioral intervention as applied to discrimination. Here's another one, which is sort of evident of kind of a decentering process that you might think about in a cognitive behavioral intervention. Discrimination comes in many forms and it's an ugly thing. It's very sad and it exists and I have to live with it. Because I live with it doesn't mean I have to be like it. So just a couple of participant quotes. There's more in the paper. I also mentioned that we did a pilot randomized controlled trial. We put awareness versus a neutral writing task with the same amount of time and exposure to therapists. And we tracked people at baseline, at conclusion of the intervention, and at 4-month post-randomization. Participants who were in a randomized controlled trial, which is also, you can find the results here. And then we were looking at feasibility. So we wanted participants to complete 7 or more intervention sessions that met that metric. We wanted our participants to complete all of the intervention sessions, 70% to do that, and that happened. We wanted assessment measures to be completed quickly enough. So these are the kinds of things for building up to a larger trial. We wanted more than 90% complete study data, which we got, except for viral load, which was due to many lab issues that come up when you're collecting blood and dealing with clinical labs. So we also wanted to look at the feasibility of the intervention to address stress related to intersecting minority statuses. So this intervention, the content is really around sexual and gender minority status. And in this manual, it was actually about sexual minority status. What we say is, you know what? It's about sexual minority status in the examples, but we want you to apply it to any status that you feel is relevant. So we talk about that in the first session. Now more in our expanded intersectional identity session. But you know, what we found is that our participants discussed on average 5.7 different individual characteristics in relation to the intervention content. Common, of course, with sexual minority status. Status living with HIV was second most common in this sample. Socioeconomic status, like 3 out of 4 participants were discussing that as a way that they're experiencing stress. Age, spirituality, religion. We actually have a really long list that I didn't put all up here. But we did see that this intervention could feasibly address multiple minority statuses. This is a pilot study. So we were not after statistical significance, but we did find that substance use, alcohol use, depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptoms all moved in the anticipated direction. Again, small pilot study, so not significant. Okay. Back to this whole biological model that I spent all that time explaining. One of the things we wanted to look at for this trial was if gene expression would change in response to this intervention, right? So along that pathway, can we change coping and therefore change how people's biology is working? So I'm just going to give you a preview of this because I'm presenting it this month in a couple of weeks at the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. We are seeing signal here. So we didn't see any differential expression of single genes, right? When we look at the pathways, when we look at the control condition over time, we saw 2 pathways that evidence some change. When we look at awareness over time, we see 59 pathways. So a lot of change evidenced over time, and we used an overrepresentation analysis. When we look at awareness versus control, we see 6 pathways. Gene expression methods, and analysis methods are not quite like the methods we're used to. Because of the multiple corrections, they don't handle things like missing data. So this was with a smaller subset sample because everyone needed to have gene expression data at all 3 time points. I'm very excited because when we look at these pathways, again, look to be along mechanistically what we would expect. So in terms of implications, we believe that awareness, this intervention, is showing some promise, and that there really does appear to be a biological signal that's associated with the intervention, and certainly also with minority stress. We have piloted awareness with sexual minority women and in groups with sexual and gender minority people. So hoping to expand that work soon, and certainly need to conduct a full-scale trial of awareness to look at a reduction of minority stress and also substance use outcomes. Because again, we saw things are moving in the right direction, but with a small sample, we really can't make those interpretations yet. So overall implications for treatment and research. So I think we can conclude that minority stress is not good for the health of sexual and gender minority people. And there really may be ways to improve our current treatments to integrate strategies for coping with minority stress, which actually Brianna, who introduced me, has been working on that very topic, which I think is a great way to move. We also really need to consider the biological pathways through which minority stress might be influencing both directly and indirectly. So indirectly through substance use, directly through stress itself, the health of sexual and gender minority people. So I know that different studies there represent work of a lot of different people, but some of whom are captured here on this slide. And here are a lot of the folks who are working in my lab or have recently done so. And last, I just want to say thank you for listening.
We have time for questions. If people have questions for the speaker.
Lovely. I'm also someone who works in some similar work here. I'm wondering, in doing the awareness study, did you find any potential harms or unintended consequences of that kind of intervention?
Good question. So definitely it was a question in my mind. Like, if we are helping people to be more aware of minority stress, is there a potential for harm? We didn't see, obviously, when I got the results, the thing about moving in the anticipated direction was a big deal because for all we knew, it was like, oh, geez, there's minority stress everywhere. I'm going to use more substances, my anxiety is higher. We actually didn't find that. So, and one of the things, like in the qualitative interviews that came up, was how empowering it was. Like, it's almost like people believe me is one part of it. Guess what? There's a whole team of scientists who are out there and know that when you get treated crappy and then you feel crappy and then you this happens at your job later that day and then this happens and now your landlord, this whole trickle. It's people that understand that this is a thing, And so we saw a lot of validation. One of the things I was surprised by was we recruited some older guys for that intervention. And I had this question about, okay, so this was in San Francisco. A lot of these guys came from places like Kansas and, the Midwest and had moved to San Francisco early on in their lives. And I thought, how relevant will this even be? And I was surprised by was that even in San Francisco, these guys were modifying their behavior in ways that were like they learned when they were 16. Living in Kansas in the 80s, for example, it seems like if you don't give the time and attention, so you're going to conceal here, you're going to, discrimination there. You're just making all these kind of automatic choices. And so people were really happy and often changing behavior after all these years, just because somebody's like, wait, You said you've never come out at work, like, let's just talk about that. You don't need to come out at work, but should we think about why you're making that decision? It's like, oh, well, I made that decision because I didn't think it was safe, but actually now that I look around, and my life is safe. They can be more open. And so I think it was paradigm shifting for some people in how they were approaching stuff.
Well, I'm curious if we can talk a bit about sort of general risk and protective factors for substance use and some of the things that are certainly going to intersect with this sexual and gender minority identities. I'm thinking of having strong support systems, supportive family environments, good role models, stable housing, and we know that among trans communities, among LGBTQ youth, there's a lot of families, you know, kicking kids out of their room, out of the house. Stable housing can be an issue, being unhoused. So that obviously is going to play a role here too and be another stressor. So it would seem like there's a lot of stressors that are kind of pointing to this, right?
Absolutely. I mean, some people would think of it almost as like syndemics, like that multiple things come together to create like an even over and above worse outcome. Absolutely. It's like, you know, if you have a stint of houselessness or inability to have stable housing, that is a stressor on its own, but it's also related to a higher likelihood of being victimized. And that experience of victimization is higher likelihood of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. And that, of course, is independently related to substance use. So you have like the multiple pathways, which don't just sort of like, oh, add on each other. They can be really like exponentially induce greater risk. And that's the challenging piece, right? Like here we have an intervention that's meant for sitting down, single person, get at some of the more structural things like kids getting thrown out of their house. We need social progress for that. And social progress has certainly happened, social change has happened, but at the same time, there's these vicious pulls in both directions, really targeting like people, you know, but it looks like politics, but it's really ultimately about individual people, their right to kind of have autonomous lives, live the lives that are the right ones for them. So the structural factors are much harder to influence, certainly lead to, you know, all of these downstream problematic health outcomes.
Wonderful presentation. I really like how you explained the minority stress model and crime awareness. And from my understanding, our industry is focused targeting FGM populations. And I wonder if you have any ideas of expanding maybe the awareness to target those who can produce harm, maybe the system, and for them to be more aware of what they're doing. So I'm thinking about, if you think about our experience, expanding to maybe policy changes, like training. Yeah.
What a great question. So I was able to present this locally at UCSF. And the CEO of our hospital said, how do I put this into the hospital? A couple of years where we were offering a lot of trainings, et cetera, not exactly awareness, but really helping people to be more aware of how, you know, about that you treat somebody is not really just about making you feel better in that moment, like you are impacting that person. But I think it's an interesting idea to explicitize what we've done with awareness, take the psychoeducation, carve it out, and do that. And yes, you should probably email me and do it. Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
All right, well, on behalf of Coffee Logan Center, I want to thank you for coming and wonderful presentation. And once again, addiction.ku.edu or at addictionku on Twitter if you want to learn about it. Okay.
That was my